Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever it is, wherever you may be. And welcome to the latest installment of Tilton Talks Crypto, the smart live stream and podcast for smart people brought to you by SmartFi. Okay? We got an interesting subject today, deciphering DAOs and crypto laws. The deciphering bit is an intended pun, I will say that. And it's a fascinating subject that really is relevant and important in the crypto world right now with what's going on. And we have a really fascinating guest who knows all about it to talk with today. We'll get more to that in a minute, but I'm here. I am one of your hosts. I'm Martin Tillier. I am the head of research at SmartFi. And the other is the man you can see next to me here, Aaron Tilton, co-founder and CEO of SmartFi.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I'm super excited about talking to Robert. I spent a little time talking to him earlier in the year when we first met. We'll talk more about that when he jumps on. But this is a topic that is very interesting, and I think people don't understand how important it is. The regulations and the structures around this are shaping the landscape for the next several years in how people will interact with crypto, how the government's going to be able to structure what we think should be the light touch on that. But it's like peering into the history and the making of the internet. Well, now we're talking about peering into and the making of blockchain technology, cryptocurrency technologies, and the regulations around that. So today's a fascinating discussion, and Robert is a very, very well-versed expert in this field in DAOs. We'll talk more about that, but also I think everybody ought to understand, your background, Martin. You're a daily contributor to NASDAQ.com and spent 40 years in financial markets, and then also traded Forex at a large brokerage in the UK. We did a whole series a whole segment on the Black Wednesday when you were there, when the British pound came undone, and everything, pandemonium, dogs and cats living together on that day. It was an interesting story. So
hey, let's not bury the lead. Let's not bury the lead there. That was the first time the markets really took on a central bank and won. That was the thing. Anyway, we're not here to talk about that.
Unique in history for sure. Yeah,
it was, and it was fun in a way, in a weird kind of way. We're not here to talk about that today, though. We are here to talk about this interesting subject of DAOs and crypto laws generally, and the legal framework under which companies like ourselves and everybody out there in the crypto space operates, and how it affects you, the user, the owner of crypto and whatever. And before we get there, though, a couple of things. Firstly, we do give away money if you watch this, if you're smart and you're everything else. And we give $50 of SMTF to the person who submits the best question while we're live on air. And that can be on anything, but a lot of the time it tends to be on what we're talking about. So, for example, last week it went to Souls B Dude. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Solis B Dude, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, however you pronounce your name, congratulations. You won $50 in SMTF for submitting what we consider to be a smart question. It was something actually that was pretty straightforward. It was, and to do with the subject that we were talking about. And he asked, how do you calculate crypto interest? So just so you know, that's the kind of thing we're looking for, something that's maybe relevant to what we're talking about. And there's no such thing as a question that's too obvious, right? Because some people don't, to us, it may seem obvious, but if people don't understand it, it's not. So feel free to ask us anything in the chat as we go along. And who knows, you might be $50 richer at the end of this, what's supposed to be 45 minutes, but usually runs over an hour. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Second thing I wanted to say is, just before we get going, my role here at SmartFi is as head of research, as we said, and that means I research, things around the news and crypto and this, that, and the other, but I also research markets to a certain extent. And in doing that this week, I found this fascinating correlation, coincidence, symmetry,
whatever it is. Yeah.
Because we talked to you last week about the fact that SMTF, the token, was celebrating its 1-year anniversary, its first birthday, and it was a year since it had been launched. But what we didn't do really was talk about how it's done in that time in real terms. And so I started to look at that this week and did a little bit of research. Now, these numbers are approximate. I'm not going to give you, point whatevers on them. But talking approximately, From when SNTF was launched, if you compare it to the two big boys in crypto, the ones that everybody knows, right? Bitcoin, since that day, as of today, is about 60% lower than it was then. Ether, also about 60% lower than it was then. Right? SNTF, 60% higher than it was then. Right? Those numbers line up in this marvelous coincidence, right? Which traders love. I can assure you, that's why Fibonacci retracement levels are important and stuff like that. We love these what seem like coincidences because they are actually informative. So what we know is that the two big boys of crypto, Bitcoin and Ether, have dropped 60%, and in the same time period, SNTF has gone up 60%. That's not an accident.
Right? Yeah, I mean, and we designed the token and the way it's structured with assets backing the value of the token. More like a lending protocol or like a bank, essentially. We're not a bank, obviously, but it acts like a bank. And that was designed on purpose. And there you can see the chart. The token, when it came out at about 70 cents, is now roughly trading, in the $1.15 range or something like that. So in the same period, 1 year from our, birthday when the token came out, we're still up. The rest of the market is down. Now we were up. I think it went up almost to $4. It was at one point, which was great, obviously. And we have this buyback guarantee. So it's, if you register your tokens, it's somewhat, I wouldn't say unimportant what the price is, but we guarantee that whatever you bought it at, we will buy it back at that price for any reason after a year. So all the people that had been buying it at that 70 cents range, and even it went up immediately within I think it was 2 days at $1.29. They're either even or up 60% on that first day, right? So the performance of the token is extraordinary. And we get all the time people saying, hey, what do I do with SmartFi when I go there? Because I know I can buy crypto, I can do these other things. But we tell them, join this community that funds loans with the token, right?
Yeah.
And when you put your money in a bank, the bank doesn't say, oh, by the way, here's this thing or this asset that you can trade and benefit from the money that you put into our bank. They don't do that.
They pay you 0.1% interest if you're lucky or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you're actually losing value because of inflation, right? You're losing at this rate, going to be 7% a year or something, whatever the interest rates are. It's crazy. So
we do need to say here, and you're all smart people, so you all know this anyway, right? But past performance is not necessarily indicative of future results, right? How many times have you heard that? If you've got a financial advisor at all, you've heard it many, many times. And we say it not just because we're legally required to, but because it's true. But it does give you an idea of potential, and it does tell you what has actually happened, factually happened around SNTF in the last year. And the simple fact is 60, 60, 60. Bitcoin's down 60%. Ether is down 60% over the last year. SNTF is up 60%.
Yeah.
Do with that what you will. But what I think you should do, probably from my perspective, is go to smartfi.com, click on buy now, and start yourself in a dollar cost averaging program for $10 a month, $25 a month, $50 a month, whatever you think is appropriate, and buy SNTF because it's shown that it did what it was designed to do.
Yeah, and which was resist bear markets, right? Because of the asset backing. It's the only token that we're aware of that does that. The other kind of structure behind that is that, we've seen other protocols and other projects blow up and go crazy and go to $20 billion worth of assets. And then within a period of time, evaporate. Because they're built on trading protocols. SmartFi and the SmartFi token is built on a lending protocol. Much different. We lend not only in cryptocurrency, we'll lend dollars against cryptocurrency, but we also lend on real estate. We lend on small business loans, equipment loans. So there's actually something of value underpinning the structure of the token. So.
All right. This is, to me, this is fascinating, but it's not what people came here for, right? Yep. People came here to hear about DAOs and crypto laws because it is a fascinating subject. So to that end, Aaron, why don't you introduce us to our guest, Aaron.
Yeah, Rob, I'm sure he'll come on just one second, but Robert Lambert is somebody that I met earlier this year. And it was in regards to some legislation at the state capitol that we were interested in, that we thought needed to be changed and structured a little differently. I ended up getting Rob's phone number from somebody else who was involved in the legislation, a mutual friend. We started talking, and I realized that Robert is an amazing expert on financial transactions. He's got 20-year history, currently a partner at Pulcinelli Law, and he has his background is in international finance, M&A, multinational structures. So I've got an amazing background, but has become somewhat of the go-to guy for DAOs, right? And for people who don't know what that is, that's a decentralized autonomous organization. And these organizations are very important to crypto, and we're going to talk a little more about that as we get into it. And actually, SmartFi will be adopting a DAO-like structure and will become a DAO. But when we looked at becoming a DAO, we didn't find any legal jurisdiction and structure that we thought met the requirements for SmartFi, right? The things that we do at SmartFi are unique, they're innovative, and we wanted to make sure that we had the best structure available when we make this conversion. So when I started talking to Robert, I realized really quick, this is the guy that we need to understand and need to involve in our process. But then it just so happens that he happened to be named to the Blockchain Digital Asset Task Force here in Utah. So we're both on this task force. So we've been able to talk some more and get to know each other a little more. And I want to have him on the podcast to go through the proposed legislation that is being basically discussed and debated at this task force. So without any more delay, let me introduce Robert Lamb, and welcome, Robert. Glad to have you on the podcast on Tilton Talks Crypto, and we're excited to hear about all the details that you have. I mean, so if you're on here as an observer and you're watching the podcast and you can ask a question, this is the time to ask the question. You have one of the amazing experts in the world, really, on DAOs. So thanks for jumping on, Robert. Can't wait to hear more about what you're doing.
Aaron, thank you. Martin, thank you. I'm happy to be here, happy to take questions and to discuss this. You know, Aaron, when you and I started talking about this early on, I think it was part of the Utah legislative session at the beginning of this year, the world has sort of shifted since then, right?
Yep.
And we were able to use, I think, our influence to a certain extent to tell the state of Utah to push pause, legislatively assemble the task force or authorize the task force. And then
That's right.
we were then put on the task force to then kind of take our breath, use the next few months to build out a more holistic strategy and approach to legislation for the state of Utah that we hope is influential, not only in the state of Utah, but through other states and even internationally, which we can talk about in a minute.
Yeah, and I think it was so applicable and apropos that just I think it was 10 days ago, a week and a half or whatever it was, that the CFTC came out with this decision, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that decision, but this phrase, unincorporated association, that they used to kind of penalize this group and classify them under quote unquote their DAO. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the implications of this decision by the CFTC.
Yeah, so let me put it into the proper context. And again, it came down last week, and so I think when you and I scheduled this, we were going to have a completely different topic, right? We were going to take this to a different direction. But the CFTC's case lawsuit against UkiDAO sort of changed our conversation, and it should. But let me put it into context. As a longtime international sort of structure finance lawyer, where I've represented multinationals in their international onshore and offshore structuring strategies. That's my background, and I blended that expertise recently over the last couple of years into Web3 transactions, which we'll talk about in a minute, and Web3 structures, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But what there was, I could see this coming a couple of years ago. the rise of decentralized autonomous organizations. It's decentralized. That is, you don't want structure. It's autonomous. That is, you don't want to come out from behind the curtains. And there is a almost a sacredness and ethos to that, right? To where it is crowd participation. It is basically, you know, virtual communities that are gathering for purpose, for a venture of some kind. And the magic to that, to a large extent, is that it can be by the crowd. It can truly be decentralized. Well, I could see the legal storm coming on that. I could see that it's very difficult to not be a thing, even in this wonderful
almost
world
by
of
design. That structure
Exactly.
is designed to do a certain level of obfuscation, right? In terms of, and take advantage of the network effect. This is in software, but then also using cryptocurrencies and other platforms to engage in financial transactions that exist only on a network. So there's this whole layer of kind of obfuscation through the decentralization that governments hate. Right?
That governments hate, and legal institutions and infrastructure don't accommodate.
Yeah.
And so what was going to win? What is going to win in that? That is, can you truly be a decentralized autonomous organization and still build, grow, develop enterprise value, execute on whatever your strategy is? Can you, in other words, marry the virtues of on-chain crowd sourcing with traditional legal? And, you know, 20-year lawyer, very traditional background, but yet somebody that is highly enthusiastic about the space, somebody that sort of, you know, my background is actually philosophy, so I could kind of see that there was going to be some pain and angst around paradigm shifting on both sides.
Yeah.
Right. And I know my own sort of legal institution well enough to know that there was going to be, and there continues to be, a fair amount of pain and angst with respect to this paradigm shifting that needs to ultimately happen. Now, my ideal, as somebody that's deep into this, my ideal is that you can marry the two concepts. In other words, you can compromise to a certain extent on certain aspects of decentralization, and you can come out from behind the veil a little bit and join the real world of a thing, of a structure. I won't say centralization. We don't need to go that far, I don't believe, but that you could have, with some creativity around both onshore, offshore structuring, around bifurcation of protocols and governance, you could have something of both worlds if you were creative and put it together right. And so I start servicing that client base, those that could see that I was going to be creative in building out structures. That those are the clientele that started coming to me, almost always in some level of a decentralized autonomous organization. And let me just say one thing about that. That's almost become a generic term for any sort of on-chain structure or on-chain venture that you are looking to crowd source or to appeal to these larger virtual communities using Telegram, using Discord, using Twitter. It's set up perfectly for that. And a decentralized autonomous organization is a little bit misleading at this point, because it's almost become a generic term for anything that is any sort of entity or venture that's on chain. And there is not one that fits all, right? Almost every different venture has a different appeal to structure. And so those of us that have done the paradigm shift and are willing to sort of marry these two worlds together, we're doing our best to create a structure. Now, also, Aaron, as you know, that also means to be a thought leader in the space. It also means to exert ourselves within legislation, which we're doing, and we'll talk about in a minute. But that's part of the process, is to ultimately have this ideal world where if you have these ideas and you want to put them on chain, can you do it in a way that is compliant and that adheres to a certain extent to structure? Now, all of that is set up to talk about the CFTC case in the Uki DAO. They basically sued Uki DAO, which we don't have to get into the technicalities of what they were doing, but they basically said every single voting participant in a DAO can be liable for as an individual for any of the bad, nefarious, or illicit activity that is conducted by the DAO itself. So that's
Which
what we
is
were.
the equivalent. Would you say it's the equivalent of, like in the parlance of entity formation for liability or to limit liability is the equivalent of piercing a corporate veil or an LLC veil or whatever. They pierce the veil of, the decentralization, right? They're trying to go after each individual that might have some responsibility for whatever was going on through a vote, even though they may not be the head of this organization, but they have opened themselves up to individual liability. Is that what you would say?
That's exactly right. I think you characterized it exactly right. The term that they're using is they're designating this Uki DAO as an unincorporated association.
Yeah.
That is basically a legal term for saying that they can, as you say, pierce whatever virtual veil they thought they had by functioning as an organization. And basically, they are now saying that the individuals can be liable. Now, that's exactly why you form an entity. That's the clashing of worlds now that's happening. And so, go ahead, Martin. Yeah,
I was going to say, let me give the layman's take on this. Right, it's scary as crap. That's the layman's take.
Yeah.
Because what
yeah.
it's saying is what we're saying here is basically all of us that have an involvement in crypto in any way, shape, or form. If the DAO that we're associated with, or the project that we're associated with, something goes wrong, whether intentional or unintentional, we're all liable, and that's crazy. That's why corporations were formed in the first place, as you were just saying, Rob, was to avoid that situation. So what are you actually? I mean, I don't want to say what are you doing about it. It's not your responsibility to put the whole world right. But what I know you are doing something about it. Through the task force in Utah, you're designing some model legislation that hopefully will be adopted elsewhere. That ultimately solves this problem. It gives a legal personality to a DAO, if you like. It gives it a status and a function that protects the people involved. So what's that legislation starting to look like as you start to draw it up?
Martin, exactly right. The reason that you have entities is to create and protect individual liability. You create a legal entity, and the legal entity becomes the thing that is subject to all liability, protecting those individuals. The whole idea behind that, of course, is that there is high degree of risk in venturing, right? And so you need that level of protection. It is the genius behind corporate structuring, corporate entities. So people come to me, and these DAO ventures come to me, and we look at it and say, we want to make sure that we create, through creative structuring, we want to create a certain amount of liability protection. Now, let me just shotgun a couple of options that they have. There are cooperatives. That is a traditional structure that's sort of member ethos driven, and that in some states lends itself really nicely to a DAO venture, mostly in a nonprofit context, but it can be used. So cooperatives is one opportunity, one option that some of these groups can use, a traditional cooperative. They can also go to states that have adapted their limited liability code to DAOs. And there's 3 states that have done that: Wyoming, Vermont, and Tennessee. Now that's an option, right? They can do that. And in essence, that says we will take limited liability and wrap it around your DAO venture. Now that doesn't work perfectly. It doesn't fit perfectly. And there has been a lot of criticism with respect to those 3 states, both complimentary that they're in the game and complimentary that they're trying, which I think is fantastic. But it just isn't a total and perfect fit, but it's working in the sense that there's a lot of different DAOs that are going into those states and incorporating and receiving the benefit of that wrapper. There's also offshore foundation rules that isn't necessarily DAO specific. That is this legislation in offshore jurisdictions like Cayman Island, British Virgin Islands, Singapore is another one, Guernsey is another one, where you can take advantage of traditional foundation structures and you can utilize the limited liability protection that those offer. And you can, in essence, become an offshore entity for the purpose of having a thing, that is that corporate form and shell, that protection, and then function and operate in an offshore environment. Those can be fairly expensive. They can be something of a headache. You got to monitor them very, very closely. And none of this really solves all of your problems.
Yeah.
We are specifically dealing with limited liability. Go ahead.
For a company like SmartFi, we take great pains to make sure that we're U.S. centric, because there is a certain level of trust that other people in the world have about the judicial system. Even though it might not be there, it still has problems. It's better than whatever's second, right? So the judicial system in the United States, the freedoms that we have, all of the things that we do here in the U.S. that allow us to have certain, what I would say that, the preeminent judicial structure for recourse, right? If something goes wrong, you want to have a place where you can do something. But going offshore for a company like SmartFi is not really an option. We do have offshore entities, but they're only really to comply with those other offshore jurisdictions, right? Not to get away from the U.S. We want to stay here. We're here. This is where we're formed. I live here. But so the places you're talking about are helpful, but they're not ideal. And so maybe we can talk about in this new entity type, at least from my understanding, and I think maybe from yours as well, it will be somewhat historic, right? So maybe we can talk about the structure and what's different about what is being proposed at the task force.
Yeah. So Aaron, let me just underscore a couple of the things that you said. Then yeah, let's sort of move on to what we're trying to do with respect to the Utah legislative strategy and approach. You're exactly right. I think that ultimately an offshore strategy could work, and to a certain extent, you may want to be international. That is the kind of cool thing about decentralized autonomous organizations, is that they tend to be not only international but ajurisdictional. That is, they're truly international, they're truly offshore, they're truly everywhere. And you want to be able to attract both talent, developer talent, and dollars, and other resources, know-how, skill, ability, access to markets, which all my DAO clients are almost all in international space. And so I'm not afraid of the international structure, because these tend to be ajurisdictional anyway and very international. But to underscore your point, if you don't have a United States solution, you're not solving the problem.
Yeah.
You're definitely not solving the structure problem. This is the best jurisdiction for jurisprudence. This is the best place to be for intellectual property protection, which is almost always an issue. We're talking about technology companies.
Yeah.
So you want to have your intellectual property here, located here. And so entity formation here ultimately is going to be needed and necessary. And I believe will ultimately be the result. We're ultimately going to get to, I think, to the right place with respect to entity formation for DAOs here in the United States. Let me just add one more thing before we go to the Utah Task Force. One of the issues that we're not solving by way of just straight entity and liability structuring, we're not necessarily solving securities issues, and we're not trying to, frankly. We love the fact that we could create a Utah DAO code, which we'll talk about, and be effective in doing so, but that doesn't necessarily solve what securities issues you may have. Now, that's not indifferent than any other corporation or LLC that you might form anywhere else. But that tends to be one of the reasons that's pushing a lot of these DAO formations offshore. Not that they're trying to avoid rules here in the United States, just that they're trying to navigate through a high degree of uncertainty with respect to what is happening here in the United States. Now, I believe that's getting better. The Lewis legislation, I think, ultimately will drive us to at least a settled place. I think that DAOs are getting better too with respect to their token economic strategies and to stay more within the bounds of the Howey test, as they call it. But for purposes of this, we'll come back later and talk about our security strategies. But that's another reason that a lot of them are going offshore, is because they just are so unsettled with respect to what the United States is doing. And I agree with that. It is very unsettling. But I think with some progress, I think after the midterm elections, I think that there will be some motivation and momentum to get federal legislation at least settled with respect to commodity securities treatment and creating a little bit more parameter around token economics.
Yeah, and this current administration, at least what's coming out of the SEC, Chairman Gensler and the CFTC, not super excited about what they're doing. It's not super positive, because I think they're taking kind of a really government needs to control approach, instead of having a collaborative process with the crypto community. And so then it leads us to say, okay, well, if we don't feel like we can get what we need at the federal level, right? There's maybe a lot of dysfunction at the federal level. Can we go to a state level and do the things that we can do, which obviously is the task force, right? And I think if it can be done anywhere, having been in the state legislature in Utah and seeing really behind the curtain, see how the sausage is made, Utah is an amazing place where you get a lot of collaboration and cooperation between industry and the state to move forward individual rights to participate in financial transactions. I've seen that firsthand, yeah. Right? And so at the task force, I mean, we're seeing that play out. So I would love to hear more about the innovations around the proposed legislation, because at the heart of it, it seems to me like it's protection for the individual actor, the asset owner. In the first session that we met earlier this year, the legislation that we were involved with defined what I would say is kind of the user's rights to use its own property, its digital property. It was a fundamental recognition of digital assets by the taxpayers and voters and constituents here in Utah. And I know there was a focus by the group that was involved in that to specifically do that. You and I were there, kind of in these meetings, and helped give input that needed to be addressed first. And now the task force is adding to that framework, of that base layer, that foundation in this legislation that you've got proposed.
So, as you know, Aaron, we showed up for the first task force, and I think the Senator Cullimore of the state of Utah, Representative Tusher from the state of Utah, they both basically articulated Decentralized Autonomous Organization legislation as a priority for the task force. And just so your wider audience knows, I think the state of Utah sits in session just once a year, January through February. And so a lot of the work is done in anticipating that time period. So that's we're in process right now. They put me as chair of the DAO subcommittee, and so we are meeting on a regular basis. We have access to the Utah Legislative Council office, and they've allocated resources to assist me. And this is the approach that we're taking. We are in the process right now of working through the model law. There was a legal organization, and I just forget which one, but there was a legal organization that basically came forward and said, we have to have something more than what Wyoming, Tennessee, and Vermont are doing. Yeah. We have to have something more holistic, deeper, that truly addresses all of the issues and is consistent with the overall ethos of a DAO, meaning that there has to be a level of autonomy. There has to be a level of smart contract integration into the bylaws. There has to be more of a deeper holistic approach to legislation than just taking an LLC code and wrapping it around DAO. In other words, that's a great effort, but it doesn't complete the process. So I was persuaded by that, if I'm being honest. There's still a lot of work to do, but we have basically taken the model law that's being circulated out there, and almost anybody can grab it, and we are making a deeper holistic approach to working that model law, taking learnings from the industry, taking input and insight from the industry, learning from what some of the other states are doing, what has worked, what has not worked with respect to limited liability wrappers. And we are integrating all that into one code. And we are actually creating a decentralized autonomous organization statute here in the state of Utah that will have more of a complete code approach to providing limited liability, entity creation. It will preserve to a large extent anonymity, which we can talk about in a minute, which is a big deal. It will require that some of the technical aspects of smart contract are proved, and that is that they're integrated and proved to be integrated with an accreditation authority. And we've identified tax treatment as flow through. So anyway, we have been very pro crypto, very pro digital asset, and very pro DAO in creating this proposed legislation. We probably have a little bit of a hill to climb. I don't think from a paradigm standpoint that everybody gets exactly how important this is. But we want to be aggressive, and we want to show the rest of the United States and even some of these other jurisdictions that we have to take something of a more holistic approach to creating the type of organization that can really thrive on chain and that can have code legitimacy, can have legal legitimacy as they sort of form and then move forward.
Can I just point out, you touched on one thing there. You just said the word once, and I don't want to scare everybody. We've had enough scary words today talking about personal responsibility within a DAO and this and liability and everything else. But you mentioned taxation, right? And that is a scary word to most people, right? But to be honest, if this is going to actually achieve like major, if it's going to be widely adopted as a law, that's going to matter because in my experience, and I've been on this earth 61 years, and unfortunately I've been dealing with governments all of those 61 years, the one thing that governments like more than anything else is to tax things. And without DAOs being actually having a defined structure, a defined personality, the multinational nature of them, everything else, forcing people to operate offshore, everything means they can't be taxed. So if from the government's perspective, it's very, very short-sighted to take this shotgun approach right now and go out there and attack DAOs and attack the people that form them and everything else, when in actual fact, they could just come to some sensible agreement as to how the thing can exist, and then they'll be able to tax it. Now, we don't want to be taxed. It does. But at the same time, to me, it seems that is going to be one of the things that's going to drive this forward, because it creates a taxable entity. It's not something that most people would think of as a good thing, but in some ways, when it comes to actually creating more stability in the space, it probably is, because that's the answer as to how you get governments to cooperate, is you say, okay, you can have a piece of my pie.
Yeah, and I just saw this question come up here, Lagos Bear, right? I don't know where that question came from, but he says the real question is, how does this protect us from bad actors in the crypto markets? Great question, because nobody cares about all this stuff until they figure out, what does it mean to me? You know, what's the implications for me, right? And without going into too much detail, I can give a little bit of my opinion on that answer. But there are two things. And if you read, we have a blog on SmartFi, and you read this thing about what we call DeFi sheriffs, right? And I think there's a misnomer out there by even the crypto community that somehow software in and of itself has virtue above people, right? And above structure, because it's supposed to be dispassionate, right? And it's a series of binary inputs, and it's the letter of the law and all these adherences and all these different things. Well, I have yet to meet anybody that's created the perfect software, right? We know that people have lost crypto through contract hacks, smart contract hacks, social engineering hacks, and just plain forgetfulness, forgot their passphrases for their wallet. And so they've lost all their Bitcoin. 20% of Bitcoin is locked in wallets that nobody can get to, right? Because they don't remember the passphrases, these things. So when we talk about how does this protect us? Well, I think there are two things. And it's a series of fundamental building blocks. So if you look at, just imagine kind of a foundation to a house or a pyramid or something, there are going to be blocks on the bottom. And there are groups of them, one of which is DAOs, right, as an organizational structure, that if and when they have official recognition, now a light-handed government can help protect those assets, because that's what governments really are designed to do, at least if they're set up properly, is to protect the rights of individuals, right? And if this software somehow through fraud, theft, or errors violates the rights of these individuals and deprives them of the right of that property, government is supposed to be able to be put into a position. And when I say government, we're the government. It's us, right? I'm kind of living proof that you can go out and run for office and go do some good stuff, right? But I'm no longer in government anymore. I'm an average guy. I run a crypto company, and now I'm trying to take my experience in government and help protect the rights of the people that use my platform and use our process and use our assets and all of these other things. But the DAO will be one measure for official recognition. There are other pieces of legislation we'll talk about on other podcasts. The sheriff note is one where, given a certain technology, that we should entrust other members of the government to right these wrongs and correct these infractions, and where the software has deprived us of assets, or bad actors have deprived us of assets through theft, error, or fraud. So your question, Logos Bear, was these are setting the fundamental premise into place, the framework around the details of these rules that the state will help implement that will protect your assets and protect you from liability against the government, right? So it's the people telling the government how to protect the assets that we use daily. And I think that's what's important about this task force. So hopefully I'm not taking this off topic, but it's a very important question. And also, let me state this. On this podcast, we get pretty deep into issues. So this is not a podcast that if you don't want to become smarter and dig into the details and understand the complexities around this topic, because these are very complex topics, this is not the podcast for you. We don't get on here and pump stuff and, try to convince you to do things that, that are designed to enrich a few people, those kind of things. This is a serious podcast about detailed information that's related to self-governance, right? And so that's why it's important. And so for this, the comment that was mentioned earlier, stay tuned. You're going to hear a lot more about how this matters to you, not only today, but in the future. You'll have protocols and you'll have DAOs that, if in the case they do get hacked, or they have errors, or other issues, you're going to have an advocate at the state level in Utah that will help you recover assets or protect them in the first place. So that's why this is important, and this is why it's important to you. Go ahead, Rob. I kind of interjected there, but I think it was important to get this fundamental aspect.
Yeah, Aaron, you're in a better place to answer that question than I am. I think that was exactly right, and I don't have much to add on that. Let me say this. I think that the ideal of on-chain transactions are that it is, you hear the word all the time, trustless, right? I mean, I think that's the ideal. And I think sometimes when I'm around those that are doctrinaire about the space, that are fully committed to the space, there tends to be something of a utopian notion that that you can ultimately, artificial intelligence, which is ultimately what these really true fine-tuned smart contracts are, that they can actually create a place where trustlessness is a real thing, is an achievable thing. And again, we know that there are bad actors. We know that there are nefarious players, and more institutional oversight isn't necessarily the answer, but some very important streamlined code and regulatory infrastructure, I think, ultimately helps get us to a better place. And in truth, we'll never get there if we don't have it. That is, if there is not some level of overlay, that if there isn't some level of legislative clarity and expectation, we ultimately don't get to that more ideal place. But there is technology there, to your point, Aaron. There is technology there to achieve a level of proof and a level of accreditation that should ultimately exceed a more analog environment of transactions.
I want to get to a couple of the questions that we're getting up here, because one of them here is really relevant to what you just said. Barriga Lucky on Telegram says crypto should be free of regulation. How do we avoid it? My answer to that, Barriga Lucky, would be, yeah, I should be a multi-billionaire, but I'm not, right? Some things that we wish for and that we really believe can be done, just we have to accept the fact that we live in the real world, and crypto operates in the real world. And I think what you were just saying, Rob, in a kind of a, to just distill it down, was that we can't avoid it, right? So to ask how do we avoid regulation completely in the crypto world is to ask, a question that asks for something that is just undoable. What we need to do, and what you're working at and Aaron's working at in the Digital Asset Task Force there in Utah, and people are working out around the country, in fact, around the world, is to make sure that the level of regulation is as light as it can be and as considerate as it can be to the industry itself and to the participants in the industry. And where crypto is different is that when we talk about the participants in the industry, we're not just talking about Aaron as CEO or me as head of research or employees of the companies, because they are structured as DAOs. They are autonomous organizations, decentralized autonomous organizations. And that means that when we talk about the crypto industry, we're talking about millions of people around the world, maybe even billions of people around the world, who own crypto assets, who are part of those DAOs by default, if nothing else. And so to say that we can avoid regulation, I'm sorry, Barriga Lucky, I'm not sure that we can. Would it be nice if we could? Sure, it'd be great. But I'm not sure we can. And so if we accept that reality that we can't avoid it, what we do want to avoid is the kind of regulation that does harm. And I think that's where you, Rob, and you, Aaron, and all the people on that task force, and as I say, lots of people around the world are really doing stellar work here, because you're trying to square that circle. You're trying to come up with a way that we can satisfy the reality that regulation is coming, and do it in such a way that it still allows the industry to grow as it should, to mature as it should, and to flourish as it should, and therefore all the people involved in it, and that's everybody who owns any crypto asset whatsoever, to benefit from that. So, and I think long answer to a short question.
The issue here, and we got to get to. I want to make sure that we get to Rob's feature set around the DAO legislation, so we can talk about how Utah's proposed legislation is historic. But the real quick answer is, when morals of society, and this is a famous quote, but the mores are sufficient, laws are unnecessary, right? When the mores or the morals are insufficient, laws are unenforceable. So the real structure behind all of this is not about free of regulation, but the appropriate ones that foster freedom and choice and use of our property. Because if you don't have anything that gives you the empowerment to utilize your assets the way that you think you should, and is recognized by enforcement, you're just kind of twisting in the wind, and there's always going to be bad people. The only time we would never have that is if there was just good people, right? So that's never going to happen. It's an idealism that doesn't exist. But Rob, let's go to that so we can talk about, kind of these structures, the smart contract, these other authoritative things in the structure that we think enhance the property rights and the use of that property in a DAO.
Okay, so yeah, I'll just attack the proposed legislation in its current form. Again, we know that there's going to be some pushing and pulling, and there's going to be a lot of industry. We're going to open up to industry voices and what have you before we drive all the way through to proposal in January or February before the state legislature. So for now, we're working it, right? And here are some of the fundamentals of the law. It does create it. Well, first off, as I said before, it's its own legislation. It is not adapting into limited liability code. It's not leaning on those, and unless we decide that that's helpful as well, which we may. We may do some adjustments to the limited liability code. We may do some adjustments to the cooperative code, and we may take that sort of full holistic strategy. But what I'm referring to now is the code.
Let me make one clarification too, so the people don't think that we're driving this. This is under the leadership of Representative Moss.
That's right.
Representative Tusher. I think Representative Moss is the sponsor of the bill and opened the bill file. And then under the leadership of Senator Colmore, these are the guys that are running this. They are in the leadership of the House and the Senate. So we're basically there to provide them some of the education that they need so that they can drive this forward. It is not I or not, Rob, and we're not doing this. It's these members of the legislative body and the governor and everybody that will eventually have all their say and push in what this is. But having said that, now go ahead.
Thank you. That's exactly right. And to a large extent, we're volunteers, right? Aaron, you and I are volunteers. And truthfully, we're not advocates. At least at this point, we're not advocates either. We're trying to take the very best learnings from across the world, across the United States, and adapt something that we think ultimately is going to be good for the industry. But that's our goal, right? And we're not there yet, but that's the end point. Some fundamentals that the proposed legislation in draft form has right now. It creates an absolute legal entity, a DAO as an actual entity. It creates legal personality, which also means that there is very clear and distinguished limited liability in the act itself for all those that participate in a DAO. This is the part where it really is unique and where we leaned on the model code and some other learnings. It has technical requirements, which will be a little bit burdensome for some of the initial applications, but ultimately I think that the process will refine itself and there will be something of a streamlined process, ultimately, perhaps even an on-chain click and apply process, but your DAO itself has
like a templated smart contract.
Exactly, a templated smart contract. Exactly. In other words, under the code, you have to prove that you truly are a DAO that is on-chain within a community purpose, and that you have the technical aspects of that and all the technical characteristics of that. And the code itself is pretty thorough in saying, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? And
when you say code, you're talking about software, not legal.
No, sorry. Yeah, let me make sure. The legislative code, as it is in its current form, has outlined what is required by way of software code. So that's thank you for clarifying that. And so those technical aspects, there is an accreditation authority that is contemplated. That is those that have technical skill set that can actually go in and look at what is being proposed, look at the software code, look at the smart contracts, and make sure that they are indeed something that is truly a decentralized autonomous organization. So there is a clearing, there is a gatekeeper. And once that passes, and again, I think I acknowledge that that's going to be probably the more burdensome part of the application, but we think it's necessary. And the other thing is that
I would make that comparison to when we did our SMTF token, right? The SmartFi token. We went through a code audit. We hired a firm called Paladin. They went through and audited our smart contract. We used a BEP20 token, so it has a protocol. It was already built. It was a template that we used, but then we modified it to meet our needs and our specific utility. And then we had to have that code audited by another firm to make sure that it couldn't be hacked and that it had all the necessary appropriate things. And I see it as basically the same thing.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It will be formed under filed bylaws. And so not an operating agreement, but bylaws. And there will be something of a form that will be required. There will be adjustments allowed, of course, in it. The other part of it that's really important is that in its current form, we'll see where this ultimately goes, that there can be anonymity in the names. That is, you can redact individual names in the bylaws themselves. So again, we get that that's an important ethos to the ultimate DAO formation, which we think is important. Also, and again, there's more to it than this, but these are the highlights. To Martin's point earlier, it has one provision for taxation that allows, like an LLC, for a limited liability pass-through treatment under tax rules and laws. Now, we get that that has to matter with respect to who they are from a state standpoint, who they are from a federal standpoint, but hopefully that will work. Hopefully that will be attractive. I think that, to Martin's point before, until the quickest way to legislative legitimacy is to work the tax issue out, right? Yeah. Because when you're seen as something that is revenue generating and revenue potential, all of a sudden the votes are a little bit easier to get at that point. So
yeah, and I think that's we're going to run out of time, and it just shows the level of engagement we've had and everything else, and the fact that we go on this shows how interesting this subject is. We were going to get to a bunch of news stories, or some news stories that we were going to talk about, and we're going to run out of time before we get there because it is such an interesting subject. I do want to say part of the reason it's in the news now, though, are some of the things that we were going to touch on. We were going to talk about a new UK law that allows the state to, in certain circumstances, seize, freeze, and recover crypto assets, right? Easier and faster. These kind of things are out there. There are these, these measures to push heavy-handed, centralized federal or central government regulation onto crypto. And I just want to reiterate for the people out there that what we believe at SmartFi, what I think most people in the crypto world believe, is that if regulation is to come, and it probably is, we need to be proactive in what form it takes. Now, Aaron and Rob have volunteered their time on helping to craft legislation that will do that. But we kind of all need to do that too, just in terms of the pressure we put on our elected representatives, this, that, and the other. We are lucky enough to live in a democracy, and so we can make our voice heard, not always acted on, but heard, and we need to do that. So, it's an important subject. It's a very technical one, and I know that for a lot of people that means it's kind of a little bit boring, but the potential implications of it are not boring, and we need to understand that, right? Because we can't do what we want to do. We can't exist unless we get this right. And for all of the details and all of the stuff, let's not lose sight of that number one fact, right?
It's your assets at stake. If we don't go out and proactively do these kind of things and structure this and build it and do it in a way that is intelligent and has leadership attributes that allow the people that we elect to lead out on this and educate them on what needs to be done, all the bad things are going to happen, because in a void of activity and proactiveness comes the reactive nature, where the negative voices, the people who want to control assets, and I mean, there's this constant push and pull between being free to do what you want to do and be controlled and have the government actually dictate or legislate your property, right? And social engineer society into something that requires people to be more reliant on government, and we don't want that, right? We want to be more reliant.
Even if we don't, even if that's not a point, the point is that we want to be able to just prosper. And I keep coming back to this, and
you can't do that if the government's always telling you what to do, right?
Yeah, talking about the 60-60-60 thing, just to reiterate, since the SmartFi token was launched, Bitcoin's down 60%, Ether's down 60%, SMTF is up 60%. Yeah. Right? We can't do that. Yeah, we can't. The reason that's important is because that affects people's actual wallets, not their virtual wallets, their real physical wallets. It affects their wealth. And for me, that is actually really important that we stress things, because that's what people care about. At the end of the day, that's what they care about. They care about their own wealth creation, wealth generation, wealth preservation. And we can do that the way SmartFi is structured through SMTF to some extent. And again, I'm not making predictions that would be illegal and foolish. But I'm just saying that to this point, we've done it. But we also, if we can only do that if we get the legislative and regulatory structure around crypto in general right. So I just want to say thank you to Rob for your efforts in that, because people like you who bring that level of expertise to this subject and deploy it, you're doing it for all of us. And I, for one, want to say I appreciate it. because it really does. It's what's going to make a difference. It's what's going to allow us all to do what we really want to do, which is make money. Do I sound trite? Yeah, probably.
It's like a greedy capitalist. Come on, right? I mean,
who wants to be that? I'm that big guy with the top hat on the Monopoly board. Right?
Yeah.
All right. So we have really run out of time. Again, I want to say thank you to Rob. Really fascinating to hear your views. I want to say thank you to everybody that submitted questions, that engaged with us. We love it. I do want to say, please, if you get the chance, subscribe, all of that stuff that everybody says on every podcast. They say it for a reason. It does help with the algos. It does help us to spread the word, to spread the message, to get the message out there. And we really need to do it. And I would also say, if you don't know a lot about SmartFi, go to smartfi.com, get involved. The easiest and best way to get involved is just to buy the token. You don't have to lay out thousands of dollars. You can do it in small increments if you want. While you get a feel for it, we'll give you a 100% buyback guarantee on those purchases if the tokens are registered, and there's a couple of other conditions. You can find those out at the website, but go there, find out what we're about, get involved. Thanks again.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you.